The idea started small. At first, it was just a practical thought about using the land so it couldn't be ignored anymore. Then it got more specific, then funnier, then impossible to resist. The next day, I called a local landscaper I'd seen work around the neighborhood. I explained the situation and asked him to come take a look. He walked the line with me, studied the survey flags, looked at the fence sitting well behind them, and immediately understood the geometry of the problem. When he asked what I wanted to put there, I told him I was thinking about raised planter boxes running the full length of the strip. He raised an eyebrow and asked what I planned to plant in them. I looked at the fence, then back at him, and said bamboo. Big, clumping bamboo, the kind people use when they want fast privacy. He laughed the way someone laughs when they realize an idea is both legal and deeply inconvenient for the person on the receiving end. The following Monday, his crew arrived with lumber, steel posts, and a small excavator. I walked outside with coffee just as they started unloading. Right on schedule, the neighbors stepped onto their deck and stared down into the yard trying to figure out what was happening. The crew went around the side, through the access point, and started digging on the strip inside the fence. Not on the neighbor's land, on mine. It took a couple of minutes for the husband to come down and approach the worksite. He asked what was going on, and one of the crew members calmly said he'd have to talk to the property owner. So I walked over and told him we were installing planters on my property. He immediately pointed behind him and said that was his yard. I pointed to the survey flags and told him it was not. For the first time since this began, he didn't have a quick answer. He just stood there looking from the flags to the holes being dug, and I could see the reality settling in. The land he had decided was close enough to his was about to become very real again. He tried one more angle and said I couldn't just build things in his yard. I told him I wasn't. His wife came down then and asked what exactly was being installed. I said planters. The landscaper helpfully added that they were going to be large ones. Work continued while they stood there watching, and by the end of the second day, a long run of tall cedar planter boxes sat along the survey line, reinforced, filled with soil, more like a low wall than a garden feature. Then came the bamboo. At first it didn't look like much, just young green stalks with thin leaves moving in the breeze. But bamboo has a way of turning intent into result very quickly. Within weeks it started climbing. New growth appeared constantly. The screen thickened. By midsummer it was already high enough to change the feel of the yard. By late summer it had become a dense wall of green. From my side, it looked great. It moved softly in the wind, added privacy, and turned that back stretch into something calm and finished. From their side, it was a different story. Their deck lost sunlight earlier in the afternoon. The expensive plants near the fence line started sitting in shade. Their once open view was replaced by a dense barrier of leaves and stalks just a short distance from their patio furniture. I'd occasionally hear muted conversations drifting over. Not shouting, just the sound of people realizing a choice they made casually was becoming expensive in a different way. About 3 weeks after the bamboo fully filled in, the husband knocked on my door. He looked different from the last time we'd spoken, less certain, more tired. He asked if we could talk, and we stepped onto the porch. He said the bamboo was ruining the yard. I told him it was on my land. He said he knew, but it was blocking sun, killing their plants, changing everything back there. I listened without helping him solve his own sentence. Then he asked whether I would consider taking the planters out. I let the silence sit there long enough for the answer to become obvious before I said, maybe. He looked relieved too soon. Then I added, if the fence moves. He asked whether I meant back to the survey line. I told him exactly. He didn't argue this time. He just nodded, already doing the math in his head. 2 weeks later, the fencing company returned. I watched from the porch as they dismantled the panels, pulled the posts, cracked concrete loose, and shifted the entire line back to where it should have gone in the first place. By the end of the day, the fence sat perfectly on the actual boundary. The next morning, the landscaper came back and removed the planters. Soil emptied, boxes loaded, bamboo dug up for transplant somewhere else. Within hours, the strip was open again. Sunlight reached their deck. My backyard gained back 8 feet of grass it had never actually lost on paper, only in practice. We still live next to each other. We wave sometimes if we happen to be outside at the same time. We're civil.
That's enough. But every now and then when I mow along the back edge, I look at that fence and notice how straight it is now, how accurately placed, how unambiguous. And I still think about how easily this all could have gone differently. If he had checked the survey, if he had taken the first conversation seriously, if he had acted like 8 feet of someone else's property was still 8 feet of someone else's property, none of the rest would have happened. Instead, he treated it like a minor inconvenience I should absorb because correcting it would cost him money. That was the part that really mattered, not the fence itself, but the assumption behind it. So I still wonder what other people would have done. Some say I handled it exactly right. Others think the bamboo was excessive. Maybe it was, but I also know this. Once someone decides your property line is flexible for their convenience, polite conversation only works if they still recognize the line. If they don't, then sometimes the only thing that makes the point clear is using your own land in a way they can no longer ignore.
I found out my neighbor had taken part of my backyard in the quietest way possible. There was no argument, no loud construction mistake anyone rushed to correct, no moment where somebody looked embarrassed and said they'd fix it. I just walked outside one morning, looked toward the back of my lot, and realized a brand new fence was sitting far closer to my house than it had any right to be. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of what I was seeing, because fences go up all the time. People want privacy. They want a clean line. They want their yard to look finished. None of that is unusual. What was unusual was that this fence wasn't sitting on the boundary. It was sitting well inside my property, and the man who put it there carried himself like it had always belonged in that exact spot. To understand why that hit me the way it did, you need to picture the neighborhood. It's one of those older suburban areas outside Dayton, where everything was built decades ago and mostly left alone after that. Wide streets, mature trees, modest homes, nothing fancy, nothing especially modern, the kind of place where people wave from behind the wheel and keep moving. I bought my house 11 years ago, right after a divorce, when all I really wanted was a quiet place that felt stable. It wasn't a big house, but it had good bones. White siding, a small front porch, and a backyard that was wider than most because the lot sat on a slight angle. That backyard was the reason I bought it. It opened up more than you expected, and along the back edge there was a line of old maple trees that had been there longer than anyone around. No fence, no hard barrier, just grass and those trees marking the property line in the way older neighborhoods sometimes do. The previous owner had actually joked about it when we were signing papers. He told me he never liked fences because once people put them up, they start acting like they're defending territory instead of living next door to each other. I remember laughing at the time, but the truth is, the open yard worked. For more than a decade, it worked perfectly. My dog used to run lazy circles back there in the evenings. Kids from down the block occasionally chased a ball across the grass and nobody cared. In the fall, the maple leaves turned bright red and covered the whole back stretch like a blanket. It felt open, calm, easy. Then the house behind mine sold, and within a month, that easy feeling started disappearing. The new owners were younger, maybe late 20s or early 30s, and from the beginning, they had that look of people arriving with a full plan already in their heads. Within days, there were trucks in and out of the driveway, roofers, painters, landscapers, window installers. The place changed fast. New siding, new roof, fresh windows, expensive-looking yard work. I figured they were excited and wanted to put their stamp on the house. Fair enough. A lot of people do that when they buy their first place. Then the fencing company showed up. Big trailer, stacks of cedar panels, metal brackets, fresh posts. I watched the crew unload everything while drinking coffee at the kitchen window and didn't think much of it. A privacy fence isn't exactly unusual. They worked all day, and by evening, the line of wood panels had started rising across the back of the property. That was when something started bothering me, though I couldn't explain it right away. The fence looked too close. Not dramatically, not in a way that screamed disaster from the street, just wrong enough that my brain kept catching on it. Perspective can fool you, especially when a new structure goes up where there used to be open space, so I told myself it was probably just that. But the next morning, I walked out with a tape measure because there was one landmark in that yard I knew well, the corner maple tree.
My original paperwork had referenced it because it sat almost right on the property line. From the corner of my porch to that tree was supposed to be roughly 30 feet. I measured from the porch toward the new fence, 22. I checked again, slower this time, thinking maybe I was pulling at an angle. Still 22. I just stood there with the tape in my hand, doing the subtraction in my head, even though I already knew the answer. 8 feet. 8 full feet of my backyard was now sitting on the other side of their brand new fence. I didn't go over there angry. At that point, I still believed there was a decent chance it was just a bad layout by the crew. Stakes get moved, measurements get rushed. Somebody reads the wrong line on a site plan. So I went around to the front and knocked. The husband answered. Tall guy, athletic build, relaxed in that very practiced way some people have when they think a conversation is already under control. I kept my tone polite and told him I thought there might be an issue with the fence placement in the back. He didn't look alarmed. He didn't even look interested. He just said their contractor followed the survey stakes. I asked whether he had a copy of the survey. He said no, but the crew knew what they were doing. I asked whether he'd be willing to double-check before the whole project was fully wrapped up, just to be safe. He crossed his arms, glanced past me like he had somewhere better to be, and said the job was already paid for. Then he added that the fence looked great where it was. That was the first real shift. Not because he argued, it was the opposite. He dismissed it so casually that the whole thing stopped feeling accidental. I told him I'd look into it. He gave me a quick smile like we were discussing something trivial and closed the door. I walked back into my yard and looked at that fence again, the clean, straight line of it cutting across grass that I knew belonged to my lot. It had the confidence of something installed by people who assumed nobody would challenge it. So 2 days later, I hired a professional surveyor. He showed up in the kind of dusty pickup truck that made you trust him immediately. Gray beard, sunburnt neck, ball cap from a survey company that was probably around longer than the houses on my street. He was one of those older men who didn't waste words because he didn't need to. He spent hours working the property line, checking old markers, referencing county documents, setting up equipment from different points. I mostly stayed on the porch and tried not to stare, though I watched more than I'd ever admit. Halfway through the process, my neighbors came out onto their back deck and stood there watching too. Nobody waved, nobody said anything. There was just this tense quiet sitting over the yard while a man with instruments and county records determined whose land was whose. By late morning, he walked over, wiped his hands on a rag, and told me I had my line. Then he pointed toward the fence and said I wasn't just a little right, I was exactly right. He took out a bundle of orange flags and started planting them one by one in a straight line across the back of the yard. Every flag landed several feet in front of the fence. By the time he finished, the visual was impossible to misunderstand. The fence enclosed 8 feet of my property, cleanly and completely. I asked him to send the official survey documents, then took photos from multiple angles with the flags lined up in front of the fence. That afternoon, I emailed everything over with a short message. Professional, clear, no drama. I told the neighbor the property had been surveyed, the fence was 8 feet inside my lot, and I was ready to talk about moving it. He didn't answer. 3 days passed, then more. Nothing. A week later, I knocked again. This time, both of them were there. And when I asked if he had seen the survey, he said yes, the way people acknowledge a weather forecast they have no intention of acting on. Then he finally got to what he really thought. He said moving the fence would cost a lot. The posts were already set in concrete, the job was done, and besides, I still had plenty of yard. That was the sentence that ended any remaining doubt in my mind, not because it was clever, but because it was so blunt. He was basically telling me that since he liked the way my land looked attached to his renovation, I should accept losing it. I asked him directly whether he was seriously suggesting I just give up 8 feet of my property. He shrugged and said fences end up a little off sometimes. Then, just like before, he ended the conversation by closing the door. That afternoon, I was furious in the quietest way possible. Not loud, not dramatic, just the kind of anger that sits in your chest and starts organizing itself into options. I went back out and looked over the fence line. On their side, everything was immaculate. New side, stone edging, fresh deck, expensive landscaping. They had poured a lot of money into making that backyard look finished, and right in the middle of it sat 8 feet of grass that still legally belonged to me. So I pulled up the county parcel maps and ordinance language. I zoomed in until the property lines were clear, then read through local rules on owner improvements. And that was when I realized something useful. The fence did not transfer ownership. The strip of land behind it was still attached to my parcel, which meant I retained the right to improve it, landscape it, or place lawful structures on it, even if the access was awkward, and even if that access happened to be through the side of my neighbor's fence.